Let's begin with President Trump is threatening to use the Insurrection Act in response to the protests over ICE operations in Minneapolis. That came in a social media post yesterday where he told politicians in Minnesota to, quote, stop the professional agitators and insurrectionists from attacking the patriots of ICE. The Insurrection Act empowers the military to make arrests and perform searches domestically. Functions the military generally otherwise is prohibited from performing inside the United States. It was last invoked in 1992 during the LA riots. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz responded on social media with an appeal to the president, writing, let's turn the temperature down. Stop this campaign of retribution. This is not who we are. Meanwhile, Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem was pressed yesterday at the White House about the ICE operations in Minneapolis and why American citizens are being asked for proof of citizenship.
In every situation, we're doing targeted enforcement. If we are on a target and doing an operation, there may be individuals surrounding that criminal that we may be asking who they are and why they're there and having them validate their identity. That's what we've always done in asking people who they are so that we know who's in those surroundings. And if they are breaking our federal laws, we will detain them as well until we run that process.
Secretary Noem, are you okay with federal agents and officers violating people's Fourth Amendment rights by asking for papers without reasonable suspicion?
Every single action that our ICE officers take is according to the law and following protocols that we have used for years, that this administration has used, that the previous administration used. They are doing everything correctly, and over again in litigation in the courts, we've proven that they've done the right thing.
Why is it? So Secretary Noem saying pretty clear there, if you are in the area of a suspected crime, it's okay to ask for your papers even when you're an American citizen. We're getting more details about the fatal shooting of Renee Good last week after records from emergency services were released yesterday. Calls to 911 began at 9:38 a.m. on January the 7th, moments after an ICE officer fired into Good's car. The New York Times reports frantic calls persisted for about an hour after that. When paramedics arrived quickly at 9:42 a.m., Good was in the driver's seat, unresponsive, with blood on her face and torso. After they removed her from the vehicle, she was not breathing and had an irregular pulse. The fire department's report said she had 2 apparent gunshot wounds on the right side of her chest, another on her left forearm, and a possible 4th, as they put it, on the left side of her head. Medics performed CPR on Good in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. Resuscitation efforts ended at 10:30 a.m. That was inside the Hennepin County Medical Center. Let's go straight to Minneapolis, where we find once again this morning MS Now reporter Nnamdi Igwanwu. Nnamdi, good morning. What is the latest there?
Good morning. We're here at the Whipple building, which serves as the de facto headquarters for ICE here in Minneapolis and has been the site of protests over the last week, particularly in the aftermath of Renee Good's death, and particularly increasingly volatile clashes overnight, where federal agents again had to use crowd control measures like tear gas and pepper balls to contain a crowd of very, very upset protesters who were here for hours protesting ICE's presence here in the city. In response to these consistent protests, we've seen both the federal government respond by fortifying the Whipple building. They've continued to add new fencing and cement blocks to try to prevent or impede protesters' ability to get too close to the entrance of this facility. But protesters, likewise, leaving their supplies alongside the area they're permitted to be in. We're seeing cases of water, which are used often when tear gassing occurs to clean out the eyes of some of these protesters. We're seeing supplies left here, food, posters. So both sides continue to stand this ground amid consistent clashes we've been seeing and a demand from some of these protesters that ICE leaves the city. I do want to point out, though, that while the protests last night got a little bit volatile, the overwhelming majority of protests we've seen here in Minneapolis have been peaceful, including a demonstration that also happened last night at a Target headquarters in downtown Minneapolis. During that demonstration, we saw 30 to 40 clergy members have a sit-in at the headquarters here in Minneapolis, demanding that Target, for one, denounce the presence of ICE in the city and state, and also reaffirm its status as a Fourth Amendment workplace, which means, prevent federal personnel from coming on its property to conduct its targeted enforcement. Now, we spoke to members of the clergy that attended that sit-in, specifically about the calls from Governor Walz that demonstrations remained peaceful. I want to play for you a bit of what we heard.
it is insane that we would ever say something about who needs to be peaceful when we are calling on the ones who are being violent to be peaceful. And so, yes, I absolutely agree with Governor Walz. I absolutely believe that we should all be peaceful. And I'm also super clear about who is not being it. So, yeah, we know that the president of the United States is trying to bait Minnesotans into being able to institute the Insurrection Act. But let's also know he also welcomed insurrectionists on January 6th.
So, according to the organizer you just heard from, they were able to secure a meeting with the CEO of Target, Brian Cornell, on Monday. We're out to Target for a response, and we're still waiting to hear back, Jonathan.
So, Nnamdi, we're certainly hearing concern from local officials there that some of these ICE tactics, Border Patrol agent tactics, are meant to be provocative, are meant to instigate some of the scenes of violence that has broken out now and then, although you're right to point out the majority of these protests are peaceful. I know there's a lot of protests planned nationwide, including in the Twin Cities this weekend, about ICE and its tactics. Talk to us about the level of concern there that some of them may also spiral out of control.
We have heard consistently from organizers since we've been here that there is a big focus on keeping things peaceful. I think that's part of the reason why they have tried to plan programming that allows residents here to voice their frustrations, but doing so in ways that, while disruptive, are peaceful. We've seen a variety of these methods of protest. They include, quote, noise demonstrations, which is when some of these protesters find or identify hotels they believe ICE agents are staying at and will create a lot of noise with instruments and pots and pans as a form of protest. We've seen large gatherings expected at parks, marches across the city. The focus always being that things need to remain peaceful, because I want to highlight people here are aware of the political environment we're in. When we talk to them, they recognize that if things get too violent, if things escalate, there is a likelihood that there could be an additional surge of federal personnel. And if there's one consistent message we have heard since we've been here, it's that that's the last thing both residents, protesters, citizens want to see, even more ICE agents descending on this city. So again, a big focus of the programming we expect to see this weekend are that things remain peaceful. I also will add, we have heard that there is a potential counter protest that may be happening on Saturday, and that has worried some people we've spoken to that could be used as an opportunity to try to incite and inflame tensions that are already high here. We certainly will be watching out for that counter protest on Saturday and see if at least law enforcement are able to make sure things remain peaceful.
MS Now reporter Nnamdi Egbuonu on the ground for us again this morning from Minneapolis. Nnamdi, thanks so much. We really appreciate it. John, I want to go back to a story we talked about there at the top of the show, which is this idea that the president is entertaining, at least, or suggesting he may use the Insurrection Act of 1792, which effectively allows the president to deploy military troops for use against U.S. citizens inside the country, not defense of the country externally, but inside the country. We've learned over this last decade or so that sometimes it's bluster, but also sometimes it's not. He's shown a willingness to use the National Guard in the streets of major American cities. Obviously, these ICE agents dressed as though they're in the military and behaving in some ways like an outside force outside the police as well. So how seriously should people be taking this idea that he could deploy the military?
They should take it seriously. Now, President Trump has threatened to do this before, and he's never followed through. You make a good point. His deployment of the National Guard earlier this year to Los Angeles, Chicago, other cities, that was not the Insurrection Act. That was different. He has yet to invoke it. The last time he threatened it significantly was in 2020. That was, of course, during the pandemic and the George Floyd protests after his murder at the hands of a Minneapolis police officer. He wanted to do it, but was talked out of it by his defense secretary and others. I am told why the White House is considering it now. White House Press Secretary Karen Leavitt defended his right to do it at her briefing yesterday, but the president has not decided if he will. It hasn't been invoked 30 times in our nation's history. George Washington did it once, but it is rare. It's usually brief. This would be seen as a marked escalation, Willie, if he were to do this in the days ahead and flood an American city with active duty military troops beyond just the Guard. That would, be, I think, triggering for a lot of people. Democrats have warned that that's exactly what he would want to do, either now or perhaps in the run-up to the midterms, to try to intimidate voters. So it's certainly a significant issue. And if he does do it, there'll be legal challenges, to be sure. And we'll hear a lot of howls or protests from both Democrats in Washington and local leaders.
And in a situation that calls for de-escalation, the president escalating or threatening to escalate at every turn here.